We don't. So, they're kind of scratched. When we get it all on there.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our September meeting of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board. Appreciate everybody being able to find their way to Waterbury. Looks like it's going to be a while before we can be back in Montpelier, as those conference rooms are being used for people who have been displaced, and the commissioner will talk a little bit more about that in his report later on. First thing also that I would like to talk about is that back in, I think it was our July meeting, we had talked about possibly reviewing the petition relative to shooting sows with cubs during bear season. And we talked about doing that sometime around when we had the presentation on black bears that Jackie will be giving us tonight. But talking to the commissioner, I think we decided that we wanted to put that off until next month, so that we can focus tonight just on the presentation, ask the questions we want about the presentation, absorb all that information, and then come back next month and discuss that petition, so that we can kind of keep the two separate. So that's the timeline for that. And I say that because over the course of the last couple of weeks, I have been copying on a couple of emails back and forth on the public who were expecting to hear that tonight. And so that has changed, and so letting everybody know that. Okay, moving on to the agenda. First thing I'd like to do is actually have everybody introduce themselves. We'll start with the board members, and we'll start over here.
Jason Sweeney, Franklin County. Paul Noel, Orleans County. Martin Van Buren, Walton County.
Allison Kruger, Chittenden County.
Brad Furlan, Caledonia County.
Ryan Bailey, Washington County.
Michael Bancroft, Orange County.
Neil Hogan, Bennington County.
And online we have
Brian McCarthy, Grand Isle County.
David Dean, Wyndham County.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Good.
okay, Bob.
Nick's coming back.
Bob, did you introduce yourself? We didn't hear you.
You're muted.
Still not hearing you, Bob. Just so FYI, we can't hear you. And also we have Nicholas Burnham, who will be joining us also when he pops back in.
Turn the volume, Robert, turn the volume up on your computer.
Yeah. Okay, Commissioner, if you want to introduce your departments.
Good evening. I'm Chris Herrick, I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we have some folks, I'll start with Abigail, and then go across the back, and then winding your way through. Abigail.
Abigail Connolly, Principal Assistant to Commissioner Herrick.
Josh Morse, Public Information Officer.
Justin Stedman, Colonel for the Wilderness. David Salzville, Program Manager with Wildlife Management.
Catherine Guessing, General Counsel.
Jonathan Camo, Black Bear Biologist. Katie Dieter, Bionutrition and Research Manager.
Okay, thank you. And so moving on, the next thing we have on the agenda is public comments. Is there anybody here to present public comments? Okay, we'll start right here. We have two people here present. We'll start right with gentlemen.
I'm Justin Lee.
If you want to, for those who want to make public comments, if you could come up front, please.
Okay.
That way everyone on the online can see you also.
You want us to sit or stand?
I think standing is fine. I mean, if standing is fine. David, being online, can you tell us where is the best place for him to stand so that people can see?
Actually, it is the way the camera's pointed, it's really behind you. or at those corners to your left and right that I can see who is there. Right.
I'm standing right here, back here, but I'm standing right back here.
Okay. I just want to make a couple of comments about this. Last weekend, we had the introduction to deer hunting for new deer hunters that don't know much about deer hunting. And we had 12 people in the course. It was taught by Nathan LaFont and Hannah Phelps. They really busted their butts to get this organized and run properly. What we did is we gutted out 2 deer, and it's really neat to have these people watch us gut the deer out. It's a whole lot better than seeing it on a film. And then skinning the deer. It was really extensive, and we need to do this every year. This is the 3rd year we've done it, and this gets people hunting deer who have never grown up around adults or relatives who have hunted deer. And I never thought about it in the old days, because I was always brought up around hunters, and most of us were. But nowadays they're not. So it's an extremely valuable course. It's a 2-day course, 8 to 6 on Saturday, 8 to 5 the next day. They feed all the people that are enrolled in it. It's really a great thing. We plan to do it again next year in September.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back, if you'd like to come up, please.
Is this good?
Sure.
Good evening, Commissioner and members of the board. My name is Bob Galvin, and I'm the Vermont State Director for the nonprofits Animal Wellness Action and the Center for Humane Economy. I'm here on behalf of our Vermont membership. I'm glad to see black bear biology and management on the agenda for tonight's meeting, and wanted to highlight 2 areas that we can be doing better for our black bears. The first item involves the sale of black bear body parts in Vermont. As you may know, black bear gallbladders and bile are used in traditional Chinese medicine as remedies for the common cold, COVID-19, and even some cancers. And there is a growing demand internationally as populations of Asian bears dwindle. After seeing a concerning post on Facebook where a Vermonter was trying to buy bear gallbladders, I sent an email to the commissioner, to the bear biologist, and the entire board in May, asking what the board and department's position on the sale of black bear body parts in Vermont is. I have followed up several times without receiving a response and would appreciate the answer. I'd like to remind folks that only 6 states allow the sale of bear gallbladders and other viscera from bears killed legally inside the state's jurisdiction, and Vermont is one of them. The second item I would like to address is the length of the bear hound training season in Vermont. Vermont's bear hound training season begins June 1st, which makes us an outlier compared to surrounding states. In New York, Maine, and New Hampshire, the bear hound training season begins on July 1st. And in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there's no legal bear hound training season at all. Bear mothers are still not in great physical condition at the beginning of June, and her cubs are still very small. So I'm wondering why our bear hound training season is longer than the season in all of our surrounding states. And I'm wondering if the board and department are willing to consider changing these regulations. And thank you for your time, and that's all from me.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Rod Coronado, Town of Orange, also represent the nonprofit Vermont Wildlife Patrol. I reserve my comments about shooting sales with cubs to next month's meeting, but I did want to follow up some of Bob's comments in regards to the sale of internal body parts, in particular gallbladders here in Vermont. First of all, it's a great success story. I know our bear population is doing great. I'm really looking forward to the presentation from our biologists. And that's part of my concern with the trade is that it seems that states that allow the legal trade of bear gallbladders are accommodating the illegal trade by allowing those gallbladders to come into the state. You're unable to discern which ones are from a Vermont bear, legally harvested bear versus an illegally harvested bear. So that seems to be one of the issues, is that the legal bear trade is focusing on states like ours with a healthy bear population. So I read the management history for the Fish and Wildlife Department on Black Bear history, and I know you've been monitoring this issue. And I know that you also have said that if it continued to be a problem, not just here locally, but globally and nationally, that would be a reason to revisit and possibly consider prohibiting the sale of black bear gallbladder. So I'm encouraging you all to do that with the department and board members. And other than that, thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Anybody else here present tonight have any comments?
God, we had a number of online people.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take them in order or in some format or another and just introduce them?
If you'd like to comment online, please use the raise hand function and I'll just call on each person in order that I see their hand. So I'm looking for any raised hands from online commenters. All right, and I'm seeing no raised hands. So I think we do not have online commenters tonight.
Okay, thank you. Okay, going back to item number one, I just for some reason jumped to item number two, public comments, but let's go back to item number one. And that is the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting of July 26, 2023. Can I get a motion from somebody to accept the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes and
Second. And I have a second, okay. Any comments on the minutes?
yes, quickly, Mr. Chair. I notice in the minutes that they do record who spoke from the public. They do not record the topic. And I think it would be helpful for even some of us board members, but more importantly, history and others who might like to review a Fish and Wildlife Board meeting, that we knew at least what the general topic was. This evening, as an example, one of the both topics that I heard dealt with the sale of internal bear organs. Just something like that. That's all that I'm looking for, or suggesting, not looking for.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a reasonable request, and
I'll just remind David, just a reminder that this meeting is recorded as well, but I'll talk to Abigail about that.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There are no other comments. All those in favor of the motion to accept the meeting minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed? Ayes have it. Okay. We've moved on with the public comments. Okay, item number 3 on the agenda tonight is a petition regarding the use of thermal drones to assist with the locating of injured game. So tonight we have Josh Ainsworth, who is here to present that petition that came to us earlier this month. So Josh, if you would like to come up here and address the board directly, we appreciate it. Josh, why don't you come right up here and
I just have,
oh, yeah, sorry. Yep.
so my name is Josh Ainsworth. I live in Hyde Park, Vermont. I'm active duty Army National Guard and been a hunter of this state my whole life. Appreciate your time. I'll keep this brief. I know everybody's time is valuable. I'm here to petition the use of thermal drones for wildlife recovery. I understand the statute as far as it reads, no hunting, scouting. It's kind of a gray area in a lot of talks I've had with other hunters, law enforcement. So hopefully I can convey, some thoughts I have on how to regulate my proposal. So real quick, there's two types of drone operations. You have recreational, which is simply for fun, taking pictures of foliage, whatever. Anything else is commercial operations, to make money, to promote a business, something like this. So this, in my opinion, would be commercial pilot. In order to get a recreational, fly recreationally, it's just a one-time test online. It's free. It's good forever unless it's revoked. A commercial license requires an FAA proctored exam. It's quite challenging. It's good for 2 years, so you need to renew that. So part of my proposal would be, if this got approved at the state level, is kind of like we have a licensed dog tracking list, you have a approved UAS list, and those operators would have to provide Fish and Game, state police, whatnot, a copy of that license as shown in the blue right there. Any drones weighing over 0.55 pounds must be registered and a label attached to the aircraft. Both recreational and commercial may be flown at night. The only caveat, you need a light of some sort that can be seen for 3 statute miles. 400 feet elevation is allowable flight height in unsecured airspace. So that means not a lot to most everybody. My point is any civilian can go buy a drone and fly at night with a thermal camera because the FAA owns the airspace, not Fish and Game, not state police. So in me doing so, I don't think there would be anything that would be liable to be held up in court for doing something wrong, because that is the FAA law, is I can fly at night with a thermal camera. I'm here to try to create a program and a process to do it ethically, legally, and provide a service to my fellow hunters. So on page 2, these are a few photos that I took with that drone of the buffalo at Nelson Farm in Irisburg, just to show the capabilities, the different color palettes, different elevations. That drone and most high-end drones have autonomous flight capabilities. So, if I did get called out for a wounded animal, instead of just manually flying around aimlessly, I can pull up what looks like Google Maps of the wooded area. I can set a grid square, and set my elevation and speed, and that drone will fly a straight line pattern, turn, come back, doing a grid. So it's effective, time efficient, safe, quiet, very little disturbance, if any. And then I have some pros and cons. It's safe, it's quiet, time efficient. It's going to be much faster than a dog or a human being on the ground. It's a coordinated approach, as I said, due to the GPS technology. It has zoom capability, so if there was, you'd be flying with a zoomed out approach, and if you think there's a game that's wounded or dead based off how it's laying, then I have the ability to zoom in 16 times without having to actually lower and disturb possibly. And then one big thing that I feel touches on the concern of most people I've talked to is in terms of regulating. March 16th of next year, the FAA will require all UASs to be remote ID compliant. What is remote ID? It's basically a module or a software push to the device that's essentially a license plate, and it allows law enforcement, FAA, and federal agencies track the drone and the controller if it's being flown in an unsafe manner, restricted airspace. So I don't know what that looks like as far as state police, fish and game, but that in the very near future will be something that they can look at. You know, a drone is flying where it should be. It'll send a ping out like a radar, and they'll be able to tell where that operator is, where they're with their control. So to finalize my thoughts is if this became a legal service, pilots would need to provide a copy of that FAA commercial license to whatever agency, showing that they've done a FAA trained course, they know the regulations, the laws, and they would need to maintain that every 2 years. Remain remote ID compliant and perhaps be on a Fish and Wildlife approved UAS list. And possibly we would set up like a dispatch number. So if somebody called me to dispatch a bear or a deer, I could call Moana County Sheriffs or whatever and say, hey, I'm going to John Smith's house, 1234 Main Street, to further give myself responsibility on where I am and what time I'm there. By all means, I'm not trying to take away from the licensed dog trackers. There's a lot of friends that do it. These devices are a thing of the future. If it's not me petitioning today, somebody else is going to. There's other states that are already doing it. As I said, from an ethical standpoint, I'm 100 myself. If somebody's going to use a drone or a thermal camera for poaching, they're going to do it regardless. Like, there's always going to be bad apples. So I'm trying to come here openly and present a case that I think could be very beneficial to hunters to ethically get that animal sooner than later. The last thing I didn't mention, the only cons I could think of, weather dependent. You know, those things run from 1,000 to 25,000. Some are rain, snow compliant, some are. And then the time of when that animal was shot. Because obviously it takes up body heat, so. That's all I got. Hoping there'll be some discussion in the future, and I'd be willing to come to another meeting and do a demo outside or whatever I can do to further my idea.
Okay, thank you, Josh.
Thank you for your time.
Does anybody have any direct questions for Josh?
I do. How long, in your opinion, how long after a deer dies does it stay warm enough for a drone to pick it up, thermal imaging? Do you have any idea?
I mean, probably a biologist or a Warren would have a better, because I haven't been out testing this concept for obvious reasons. The good thing about a thermal drone, 24 hours, I can do it in the daytime. They usually at dusk till, midnight or whatever. I would say probably 4 to 5 hours, depending on the ambient temperature outside.
How effective would it be? Obviously, heavy wood's not gonna be able to see it at all. I would imagine you can't see through foliage.
Depends on the tool. That right there will do a pretty good job. That's about a $9,000 drone. There's $30,000 drones with LiDAR, laser capabilities, the same thing in the law enforcement scanners. That will penetrate ground for soil samples. So that it will penetrate canopy. So what I can provide to what is possible is greatly hard to tell.
How many pilots do you think, if this were to become law, would participate in this? Must have an idea club or,
So I only know one other person personally with a thermal drone. We're both in the Guard, and I've been flying as a hobbyist for fun for like 8 years, I started a small LLC for roof inspections and whatnot, which is why I bought the thermal camera. I think if people found out that they could do it, I don't have a good answer for it because it's a lot of money too. And then, you know, there's a lot of factors I've thought about that until I know how this takes off. Is it legal? Can I set a pricing structure? Or is it by donation? Like, those are down the road things that aren't important right now.
Is it illegal now to do what you're asking to do?
So I look from a just normal citizen, I think it's a gray area. It certainly says no hunting, scouting, or I believe it says recovery of wildlife. But once again, if I'm out on a cornfield flying that thing at night and a warden comes up on me, is there anything that they have that will hold up in court? And I'm saying this from an honest thought behind it, you know, because none of us own the airspace, the FAA does. And I'm a licensed pilot. You could go buy that today and fly it at night with no problem. But coming here and presenting it and trying to, I think, shows that I'm trying to do the right thing. And, you know, if I could have some guys, some girls, youth either recovered, I mean, that would be perfect for me.
Question, if, I know one perspective is to try to find the animal itself, if we're talking about an injured animal.
Yep.
And trying to find an animal laying on it. Do you have enough scoping ability on it, whatever, to find like a trail of blood? If you don't find the animal, to follow a trail of blood, if that's what you're looking for? I'm
not sure, because I haven't been out practicing that.
Yeah,
I just know from, you know, the buffalo. Like, I asked the farmer, hey, do you care if I shoot your livestock, just to see the capabilities. Without going out with a warden and doing some field tests, which I think is a viable thing we could do.
How high were you when you took those buffalo pictures?
Those pictures are probably 75 to 100 feet. And like I said, the legal altitude is 400 feet, which would be way too high when you're looking for deer. You would start higher, pick up the heat signature, lower a little bit, zoom in. And at 150, 200 feet, there's no noise disturbance for the animals.
Back to this question, to follow a blood trail, it would have to be by thermal, would it be heat off a blood trail?
And it probably would have put a lot of heat on.
Yeah, it could be done nuts.
So there is a Facebook page, Drone Deer Recovery, if anybody is on Facebook and wants to check it out.
He's in Ohio.
He's in Ohio, and it's amazing how many deer he finds that you wouldn't imagine the capabilities that he have. I've never seen him be able to see a blood trail, but he's found deer that were down but not dead. You know, you can tell because they're still moving around, so you know to back out.
I know the guy. I sent him a Facebook message talking to one of the wardens outside. I said, I'm interested in pitching this in my state. And he didn't really want to give out his info. He just said, super long road ahead of you, depending on your legislators and everything. It can be done. It's just, it's a tool that's new to so many people that they're scared to dive in and accept it. So you just got to keep after it and pitch the pros or the cons and turn the gray area into, it's a manageable, regulated thing that we can do.
I guess my look on this, and I've thought of this before after watching some of his videos, is the likelihood that people are doing it anyway without it being legalized is probably, there's somebody out there doing it.
I think he has some rules too, he doesn't give out information on other years. I think I've seen that.
Yeah, I don't know what is this, watch some of his videos and it's pretty interesting, but it's, I think people are gonna do it, you know, like everything else, if they're gonna do it. So you give them some guidance on the best way to do it. There's probably still some that, you know, as we know, aren't gonna follow the rules anyway.
And that's a great point. Maybe, like I said, with the license provided to Fish and Game, now that's one step further to where if the warden does come up on somebody flying at night, they can say, hey, can I see your car 107? Your blue license. If you don't have it, you can't be doing this.
So temperature range capabilities. Let's say it's late November, you lost gear, sun goes down, you can't hit any more than 30 degrees out, 25 degrees out. Deer's been 2 hours or 3 hours into having been shot. What sort of temperature range is that capable of picking up? Does it have to, does the animal's temperature have to drop down to that 25 degrees, let's say?
No, that's good at below 0 to over 100.
So you're gonna be able to pick up some heat coming off that animal.
Yep. And then quickly on page 2, if you look at that bottom right picture, that's called basically a internal, if you will. So you see the picture around it, that is the actual photo, and that's just pinpointing. So this would be like if I was doing a roof inspection, I just wanted a chimney, for example. If I did have an area of concentration, 10-acre field, and I see what I think is to be a deer or a bear, I can on my camera just concentrate it to that. And there's other settings to spit out Fahrenheit temperatures.
David Dean, you have a question? Your hand is raised.
Yes, I'm curious if maybe the commissioner could answer this. If our warden have taken a look at this and have any kind of reaction. And then just as a reminder, if I could ask Abigail to send me the printed package you are looking at.
So with that one, I was gonna ask for extra copy.
Yeah, sure, I got like another 5.
And Dave, at this point, it's a little premature. The department is not going to give our opinion. We haven't evaluated this thoroughly, and so I don't want to get out ahead or put the wardens in the position of weighing in just yet, because we haven't looked at all the ins and outs of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point for Josh? No? Okay, so Johnson, thank you for coming.
Yes.
I think our next step will be, we'll ask the department right now for an opinion, and they'll probably recommend that we forward a petition to them, and they'll research it, review it. But, I think the immediate concern is mine anyway, personally, is in how do you control this and how do you prevent abuse?
Absolutely.
I mean, on the surface of any rule that we but I also know that as someone who has hunted, a lot of years, and fortunately, knock on wood, have never not been able to recover a deer that I've shot. But there's been gaps between when I shot a deer by the time I recovered it. And there's no worse feeling in the world with a hunter who has, wounded a deer and can't find it. And I think that's the worst thing that can happen to anybody while they're hunting. So anything we can do to assure that we do recover the animals that we do choose to take, I think there's a great deal of value in that. So I'll just leave that conversation. So
thank you for your time.
Okay,
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Commissioner?
So I would recommend that the board just accept the petition and ask the department to come back with a recommendation after investigating it and all the available research.
Make a motion to.
Yes, please.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the petition put forth by Josh Kinsman.
I second the motion to accept the petition.
Okay, any other comments or thoughts? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of accepting the petition as presented by Josh Ainsworth, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Ayes have it. Okay, Commissioner, it's all yours. This point.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda is the black bear biology presentation and then presentation. Jacqueline, I say Como, but I think it's Como. Is that how I heard it?
Yeah.
And pronounced tonight? Okay, well, welcome, Jacqueline. You gave us a brief presentation last year that was very interesting and very well done, so we're looking forward to this one tonight.
So I'm gonna share my screen. So everyone can see my slides. All right, great.
Before you start,
Yes.
David, did you want to do an introduction?
Well, I guess Jackie has been with the department now permanently about two years now, maybe a little longer. She was with us in a limited service capacity for several years before that, working on the bear wind study on the Deerfield area, and worked with Forrest Hammond and Katie and others on that project. She comes from us with a master's from University of New Hampshire, if I remember correctly. And she grew up in New Hampshire, I believe, and a long resident, has a lot of experience in black bear management and biology, obviously.
Yeah, so I'm going to give another presentation on, black bear management and our bear project here in Vermont. Before I dive into it, like last time, I like to start every presentation talking about the mission of Vermont Fish and Wildlife, just to put the work that we do in context. So again, our mission statement is here, and it's the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. So again, this is a super big, broad mission. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have a detailed conservation project for every species in Vermont, but black bears are a species that we prioritize. And this is because we treat black bears as an umbrella species in Vermont. So we know that in order for black bears to be successful, they need access to foods provided by different wetland habitats. They need access to foods provided by young forest habitats, and they need foods provided by mature forests. And of course, these habitats are not necessarily right next to each other on the landscape, so they need a connected landscape so they can safely navigate to find the foods that they depend on. And so if we're doing a good job maintaining a healthy bear population, it means we're doing a good job maintaining these important habitats, not only for black bears, but for all the other species that rely on them, and kind of creating this conservation umbrella. So our black bear program is really a four-pronged approach. As I just referenced, habitat is really a critical part of the work we do. We also occasionally conduct research to better understand the needs of our black bear population. We regulate and oversee the state's bear hunting season, and through that harvest, we also collect really important data that helps us monitor the trends in our black bear population. And then, of course, we work with Vermonters and visitors to this state to help find ways to minimize the chance of negative interactions between people and bears. And I'm gonna go through each of these different aspects of the project in more detail. But before I do, I just want to talk about some kind of basic black bear facts that are, important to understand and how they influence some of our decision making. So first, black bears are a long-lived species. They can live into their 20s and 30s, and in fact, the oldest bear on record in Vermont was 39 years old. They're a relatively intelligent animal, because they have these long lives, they seem to have good memories, and they are able to kind of adjust their behaviors based on their life experiences. Their most powerful sense is their sense of smell, and I think this sometimes creates a disconnect between us and bears, where we're such visually oriented animals ourselves. Bears are really perceiving the world around them through their nose in a way that we really cannot relate to. And then, of course, they are opportunistic omnivores. So they have a very diverse and a very flexible diet.
Becky, next question.
Yeah.
Do you know, are you able to compare a bear's sense of smell to that of a dog?
Oh gosh, there's numbers out there. I think it's like maybe 9 times the power of like a bloodhound, something like that. Sometimes I'm bad at pulling up these.
But it's better.
But yeah, it's more sensitive than domestic dogs. Yeah. All right. So first, we're going to talk about our habitat conservation and management aspect of our project. And I really just can't emphasize enough that this is really the crux of all the work we do on behalf of black bears. It's really the central work that our department does on a whole for all of Vermont wildlife species. And this is really because without abundant, high-quality habitat, these animals are going to struggle to persist on the landscape. So it's really a critical feature of the work we do. So in order to understand what is good bear habitat, you first have to understand what do bears eat. And so like I said, they have a very diverse diet, but I think an important take home is that the majority of the foods they rely on are coming from plants. They're eating vegetation directly, different forbs, herbaceous plants, leaves, and then the other big part of their diet is the fruits produced by plants. And we call those fruits mast. And mast can be broken into 2 categories. You've got your soft mast, which are your soft fleshy fruits like strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, cherries, apples. And then you've got hard mast, which are those fruits that are protected by a hard shell. And so acorns and beech nuts are the really common ones here in Vermont, but we also have hickory and hazelnuts as well. And then bears are also eating a lot of insects. They're eating mature insects, the larvae of insects, and they are opportunistically eating meat. They will predate on newborn deer fawns and moose calves, although as those animals mature, they quickly get to a point where they can outmaneuver a bear, and they will scavenge on carcasses as well. And of course, they're eating, eggs and nestling birds and all sorts of diverse things. Really, again, the take home is that plants are a huge component of their diet. And so in order to understand bear habitat, you need to think about the types of conditions that are going to support those plants that provide food for bears. And so as I already mentioned, we're talking about different wetland habitats for a lot of the vegetation and soft mass they rely on. We're talking about young forest areas, again, for that soft mass, and then more mature forest for the hard mass. And so here is a figure from the study that Dave referenced, the Deerfield Wind Black Bear study, which we've recently wrapped up data collection for. And this is just to kind of give you like a real world perspective on how bears are using the landscape around them. So this study encompasses, or this map is kind of showing you portions of 6 different towns where this study was focused, way down here in southern Vermont. We've got Wilmington, Searsburg, Woodford, Whitingham, Reedsboro, and Stamford. And so we were interested in understanding black bear use of these black polygon areas, which were representing large concentrations of beach habitat, and how these pink triangles, which represent wind turbines, how that wind farm is going to influence bear use of that habitat. All the stars on this map show capture locations where we caught and collared black bears. And this is really where we felt like, okay, this is where we need to focus. This is our core study area. Over the course of the study, we had 45 different bears collared. And when you look at all of their locations, you quickly learn, like, this is not enough for a population of bears. So now in this map, here's this red polygon that's up here in the center. Here's the state line between Mass and Vermont, and then the state line between Vermont and New York. And so you can just see the scale of space that these animals need to rely on. And I'll say the majority of their locations of movements did occur in kind of this area, but you can see a number of bears made big forays outside of that area. And really, there's one thing that was driving the majority of those big movements, and that was beech nut availability. Beech nuts are such a critical food for our black bears. Research out of Maine showed that it's a preferred food. They will select beech nuts over acorns, even when both are available. And Maine also found that black bears they were studying were actually synchronizing their reproduction with beech nut cycles. And how this works is that beech trees typically mast together, meaning they'll all produce nuts together, but they only do that typically every other year. Well, black bears are also only reproducing every other year. A mature female, if she's successful, is only giving birth to cubs every other year. And what Maine found, and we've seen indications here in Vermont as well, is that the majority of mature females, where beech nuts are an important food source, are giving birth to cubs in the winters following big beech nut crops. And so because we have known this is an important food source for a long time, the Fish and Wildlife Department has been monitoring and evaluating beech nut and acorn availability for black bears and other wildlife since the late 80s. So there's kind of a lot going on in this figure, but if you look on this side, these numbers here are representing the average beech nut count for the plots that we sampled throughout the state. And then over here, this is the scale for the acorn count during the acorn surveys. And then I've kind of added on here our own kind of rating system for categorizing what those counts actually mean in terms of, like, is this a good crop, a bad crop, whatever. So the blue bars are beech nut counts, and then the yellow shaded areas are the acorn, represent the acorn surveys. And so really, we're thinking about anything that is, from a beech nut perspective, bears will take advantage of beech nuts as long as it's a fair crop. And so this line here is kind of showing you everything above that is good for bears, everything below it, not good. And then here is the kind of delineation between poor to fair for the acorns, that yellow dash line. And so really, you know, the take home from this figure is just that in most years, bears have at least one of these hard mass crops available to them. But we do see some years where they don't have either. And those are a challenge. 2022 is actually one of those years. It doesn't look like we surveyed beech nuts because there's no bar there. And that's because out of all of our surveys, we only found one nut in the state last year. And it's been hard to tell that the oak rating was way down here as well. And so here are a couple more real world examples of how bears are, you know, interacting with the habitat and landscape when beech nuts are available. So here is one of those individual bears from that study. These yellow circles represent all her locations. It's a little tricky to see, but you kind of make out those black polygons representing the beech concentrations. And this is what we consider her core home range. Now, when you take just a subset of her data from October 1st to November 15th in 2015, when we had a good beech nut crop, you can see her locations just shrink down. And again, it's a little hard to make out, it's so bright in here, but her locations were pretty much concentrated in those beech concentrations. And then here's a different individual bear. Her core home range was down here. This is actually right here is Atherton Meadows Wildlife Management Area, where she spent the majority of her time. And again, in the fall of 2015, when we saw good beech nut production, she actually traveled outside of her home range up into that beech concentration, spent about a month and a half up there foraging on beech nuts, then returned back to her core home range to den for the winter, came out of her den in April the next year, went right back up there for about 3 weeks, and then returned back to her core home range. And I'll say we had her collared for a number of years. Those were the only times we ever saw her go up there and leave her core home range in that direction. However, that same bear, so again, here's kind of Atherton Meadows right up there, her core home range. In the previous fall, 2014, we saw really poor beech nut production. So instead, this bear traveled south into Massachusetts, where the forest drastically changes from an oak-dominated forest to, or from a beech-dominated forest to an oak-dominated forest in Massachusetts. And she spent the fall feeding on acorns as an alternative because the beech nuts were not available. And just like what we had seen before, is once she was ready to enter her winter den, she did that back in her core home range.
How far?
This, I think it's about 4 to 5 kilometers from her home range to go up to the beach, and probably a comparable distance south into Mass. So it's not a huge distance, but we did have other bears that were moving like over 10 miles in some cases to make these types of movements. And so again, I just, this is really cool to see, right? But it's also, again, highlights how much food is driving how these bears are moving.
In the off year, where the nuts weren't as plentiful, did you find the bear in the travels going places where you wouldn't have expected to go? Like more and more populated areas or not?
Occasionally, we would see that. Well, and again, this is just an impression. It's a hard thing to tease out, and we're still actively analyzing this data. A lot of these bears, the impression they gave us, they were so direct, is that they kind of knew where they were going. We don't fully understand, is that because they, we were collaring most of these animals once they were already adults. So we don't know what they had done in years past. We don't know what they had done when they were still dependent on their mother. Occasionally, we would see these bears do what we call these kind of random walkabouts. So maybe those were like exploratory walks, checking out available habitats. But then the other theory, right, is they might be picking up scents in a way that we are just oblivious to. Bears do a ton of scent marking. Bears have overlapping home ranges. There's all sorts of stuff happening in the air that we just cannot key into because we are so limited in our sense of smell.
Jackie, I think it's important to mention the whole Stay Connected project.
Totally, yes. And I kind of speak to it, but not directly. But yeah, I will say this reiterates the importance of thinking about landscape connectivity and not just thinking about what we're doing here in Vermont, but forming regional kind of partnerships, which, as the commissioner references, the Stay Connected initiative, which is, this larger initiative that we are a partner within, trying to look at landscape connectivity. And again, not just for bears, for all species, but how can we facilitate and maintain the ability for animals to safely make these kinds of movements?
Have you found bears return in the spring back to areas that had high beech nut in the fall to get remaining beech nuts?
Definitely. Yeah, and that was a strong consideration that my predecessor, Forrest Hammond, really believed, like this, we gotta stop just talking about hard mass as being an important fall food source. It's also a very important early spring food source, and we definitely documented that with this study. Bears going back into the beach, during the spring. All right, so now that we're all experts on bear habitat, let's kind of tie that up also with what kind of the life cycle of a black bear looks like. And we're gonna take the perspective of an adult female, mature female over a 2-year period. So we'll start just randomly, we'll say year 1, she's in her winter den. The fall was a really great beech nut crop. So she spent the fall feeding on beech nuts, enters her den, gives birth to litter cubs, usually in January. It can range, litters can range anywhere from 1 to 4. There have been extreme cases documented of 5 in other places. I don't think anyone has seen that here in Vermont. But the average is usually about 2 cubs. So she gives birth to her 2 cubs in this scenario. By usually the 2nd week of April, those cubs are finally large enough to start and strong enough to start moving beyond her winter den. And that usually coincides nicely, at least with first inklings of spring green up here in Vermont. Or again, in this scenario, we know there's beech nuts still on the landscape that they can take advantage of. So, whole family unit leaves the den, and they start making very small movements because those cubs are pretty limited in their ability to travel. Small movements of her home range going to key seasonally available food sources. Or in some cases, if she needs to travel a distance they're not capable of moving yet, bear cubs are like Velcro on trees. They are such strong climbers. They're better climbers than they are walkers when they first come out. So they will go up trees and hang out in trees sometimes while she has to go forage for a couple hours. And so they continue that throughout the summer, and then into the fall, the whole family enters this physiological state that we refer to as hyperphagia. And it just basically means they become eating machines. So they are eating as much as they possibly can. They're limiting sleep and just focusing on packing on pounds before the big food shortage begins in winter.
A quick question.
Yeah.
So when a mother bear gets separated from her cubs, whether by choice or by being forced to do so, I think what I'm hearing you say is that based on their sense of smell, I'm assuming is probably how they are able to re-engage with those cubs as quickly as they can.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of cases when the cubs are very young, they're going up a tree and they're there until she comes back. I've seen it firsthand where, like, for research purposes or even accidentally, we have separated, and not just here in Vermont, but in other states where I've worked with black bears, where we've inadvertently separated them. And in that one case, I'm thinking the cubs were actually a bit older, and you heard after we backed off, but we kind of hid close enough so we could still see what was going on. That's how I started making all these vocalizations because they had been separated in a way where it was quick. She didn't quite know where they were. And if she started making those vocalizations, you heard the rustling in the trees and they came down to her. So, it's not just smell sometimes, but I've also seen where we, inadvertently caught, again, not here in Vermont, but we caught a mature female in what's called a culvert trap. And when we released her, she left that trap like a bloodhound, nose to the ground. We knew that she had 2 cubs of the year with her. And you just saw her like circling with her nose to the ground. And I think in that case, she was just tracking them to reconnect with them. Yeah, and again, I think in a lot of cases, especially when it's done by her choice, they are waiting until she comes back and basically tells them it's time to come out of the tree. So, year 2 denning. The whole family enters the den together. I didn't mention this before, but in year one, when those cubs are born, they are not in that like hibernation state. Like they are kind of like any other newborn mammal where they are just sleeping, eating, and growing as quickly as they can. But now by year two, they are entering this like reduced physiological state of hibernation. The whole family is in the den together. And then come spring, the whole family leaves the den together again. And again, they continue, foraging throughout her home range during the spring. Here's a picture from that study. It's a little hard to tell, but the bigger bear in this picture has 2 yellow ear tags. So she was a known study animal. These are her 2 cubs at the base of the tree. We often refer to them as yearlings at this point because they are now 1 year old. So late May, the whole family is still together, traveling together, looking for food together, all the same stuff they were doing the previous year. But now we kind of add a new step into the cycle in year 2, and this is the dispersal/mating stage in the life cycle. And so this is the time, usually in late spring to early summer, those cubs are taking off. They are dispersing to go set up their own home range. Typically, females, if space and resources allow, will not travel as far and may even set up a home range that is adjacent to or overlapping with their mother. But males almost always go a really far distance. And so there's a good chance like that male could be, from our perspective, states away. It may not be anywhere nearby. And that dispersal process can be like a multi-year process before that male finally finds a place in space and like establishes his own home range. And the thing that we believe is really driving this process is that the female is coming into estrus and ready to breed again. So black-bear breeding season typically really peaks here in Vermont in June. But we've seen evidence of it continuing even into August. Females will often breed with multiple males, and so their litters can have mixed paternity. And they also have a cool process called delayed implantation. So even if she's breeding in June, the sperm is like fertilizing the egg, but then it kind of goes into this state of suspension, and it actually doesn't implant in the uterus and begin developing into a fetus until November, typically when she's entering that next winter den. So back onto our kind of life cycle here. Now the female is kind of on her own, no dependent young, again, not really pregnant yet. And again, just traveling through her home range, finding food, and there's this state of hyperphagia again. If the cycle holds true with our beechnut crop, we would be back on a good beechnut cycle again. So she's eating a bunch of beechnuts, entering her winter den, and giving birth to more cubs. Okay, so that's a lot about bear habitats. Now I'm just going to talk real quick about the habitat work we do here in Vermont, and understanding that we have to understand the historical context, right? We know pre-European settlement of Vermont, our landscape was predominantly forest. Europeans settled, cut down a lot of the forest, and did their best to convert the landscape to a more agriculturally dominated landscape, which does not support a lot of the foods that bears rely on. So our bear population got really restricted to just the more like rugged, mountainous parts of the state or the more remote, lightly settled parts of the states. So really like the spine of the Green Mountains and up into the Northeast Kingdom.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, excuse me. David?
Yes, I was just wondering, most of the beech on my land has died off over the last 15 years through a disease. And I am wondering if that is widespread here in Vermont or here in the North Country. And if it is, what kind of impact does that have on the mast? Fortunately, I still have lots of oak trees and they still like them. But what is effect, if any, has that had on bear populations?
Ooh, such a great question. And I tried to glaze over that additional wrinkle to simplify things, but everything is just so complicated. I'm glad you brought it up. So there is, we call it beach bark disease. It is a non-native, kind of invasive, like multi-component pest that is detrimental to beech trees. I don't know if you guys want me to scroll all the way back, but since we've been doing these beech nut surveys, beech bark disease has been present on the Vermont landscape and again, throughout the Northeast. It is widespread everywhere in the state. It's pretty rare to see a tree that is this kind of holy grail of what we call resistant to beech bark disease. We do see a lot of trees that are what we call tolerant, where they are still clearly fighting the disease off, but surviving. And then we see a lot of trees that are in significant decline because of it. The perspective we have right now, though, is that it is still on the landscape, right? Trees live a timeline that is so much longer than ours. So it's really hard to know in 100 years, 200 years, what our beech forests are going to look like. But I strongly believe, and I think the department as a whole believes this, like, we know this is such a critical food source. We've got to maintain it and protect it as long as we can. And so that's kind of where our emphasis is, because at this point, even those really highly diseased trees are still producing enough mass that is attracting bears. Bears are using it. And again, a lot of other species rely on beech nuts beyond just bears. Is that good, David?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, again, kind of knowing historically for a while, our forest, once farm abandonment happened, we kind of entered this recovery phase, and as a whole, natural resources professionals and society started wanting to be more considerate about how we were handling our natural resources and started developing more of like a land conservation ethic. Our department from the beginning was heavily involved in this, and I guess just to sum it up, really, like when we think about our black bear habitat goals in the past from the department's perspective and now, like our focuses really are on maintaining concentrations of those important foods for bears and landscape connectivity so they can safely move. And so we're doing that in multiple ways. We're actively involved in purchasing lands to put into conservation, state-owned lands. We are writing habitat management plans and implementing those plans to try to promote a variety of habitats for wildlife, but always with bear foods as a consideration. We work a lot with private landowners, giving advice and support to help them who are interested in also promoting wildlife habitats on their lands. And a really big critical part of the habitat program is also what we call our regulatory review program, which is, basically through Act 250 and Section 248. So all big development projects in the state go through a very thorough review process. And wildlife habitat is one of the components. And so the goal of that regulatory review process is to try to first, prevent the loss of, necessary habitat for wildlife where it's possible. So maybe move a project to a different location or adjust its boundaries to protect habitats. If that's not possible, then we're trying to minimize the effects on those habitats and then also mitigate lost habitat. And within that system, we have actually set legal precedent for necessary black bear habitat. And that necessary habitat has been defined as concentrations of hard mass, so oak, but really beech is what most of the battles fall into. And then spring wetland habitats. And in both of these categories, there has to be evidence of historic and or recent use by bears.
Jackie, while you're on habitat, what, the wind project you worked on, what's the short takeaway as effectively wind turbines have bear movement or bear in general?
Ooh, ask me in a year.
You're still working on?
It is, yeah, so, I'll talk about research in a second, but we can say it now and I'll skip it when I get to the slide. We entered a contract with researchers based out of the University of Alberta who actually specialize in the analysis methods necessary to get at the objectives for Deerfield. This is a good problem to have, but we are drowning in the amount of data that we collected with that study. And so these folks have some really sophisticated statistical techniques that they're going to use. So their timeline is they will have results ready for us, hopefully by August of next summer. And then we'll hopefully have stuff kind of compiled into reports and ready for the public shortly after. But that, again, that study came out of the, this regulatory review process. All right, so yeah, research, I guess that's next.
Can I ask a quick question on habitat protection and conservation? Are we winning that battle? That's just my colleagues or not?
I think the work that we do there is so important. But it's a lot of compromise, like all of this. All wildlife management and conservation is a lot of compromise. And so, yeah, we have wins, we have losses, but we've got a lot of stuff that falls in the middle. I don't know, Catherine, you feel like that's a fair assessment?
Well, I think that's definitely true of regulatory review. Because we have to follow the regulatory standards. So, and it's not always the perfect fit. But we have had some pretty spectacular successes when it comes to actually conserving property and creating connectivity. So, it's definitely development pressure and habitat fragmentation is just a huge pressure on wildlife. And, I think, in Vermont, we're fortunate that we have Act 250 and that the 248 process, which is the regulatory process for energy development and transmission, does consider habitat. There are a lot of other places where that doesn't happen. The one drawback to that, though, is that those regulatory processes really only cover a very small percentage of the type of development that happens on the landscape. So the acquisition and the connectivity work that we do, it just becomes that much more critical.
And I think what Catherine said there is, Vermont is kind of considered one of the leaders in this aspect. Like the work that we're doing, a lot of other states don't have the same regulatory framework to allow them to have that level of influence that we do.
Thank you.
So again, the research. I will say, because of our concern about protecting habitat, a lot of our research is oriented around the habitat needs of wildlife and how best to prioritize habitat conservation. So again, we've got ongoing the Deerfield Wind Study, which we just kind of talked about. We also have kind of two kind of paired projects that are not just looking at bears, but bears are one of their focal species. But basically, these two studies being done by the University of Vermont, which we are providing expertise and data for, are looking at that connectivity issues. How do we prioritize limited resource investment into like identify the priority projects and priority areas. You know, we have done genetic work to understand the population structures of our bears, which is this cool map over here shows basic, you know, these different types of genetic variations on the landscape and ability to kind of start grouping those into genetically similar subpopulations. You know, the Stratton study, which although the final report came out in 2002, really the data collection for that occurred during the 1990s, and it was really kind of a sister study, or the Deerfield Wind study is kind of a sister study to this, where this one was looking at ski resort development, and it really was a critical component of creating justification for those designations of necessary bear habitat. You know, and while that study was going on, we also kind of partnered up with a researcher to kind of help set some standards for how to evaluate different beach stands based on evaluating the scars on those beech trees. And then kind of one of the first publications our department was involved in is, you know, research done by our first black bear biologist, Charlie Willie, and his understanding of like the early days of our recovering black bear population back in like the late 60s and 70s. And so again, this is just, you know, show like there is like a foundation of understanding that helps kind of drive the work that we're doing. There's always some more research to do as well. All right, so now let's get into the population and population management aspect of the Bear Project. So, again, kind of like the Habitat Project, I think it's helpful to understand the historical context of how Vermont has managed their bear population over time. You know, so like I said, with European settlement, we really lost the habitat to support our bear population. But also during that time, you know, people in the state had like unrestricted access to kill or interact with bears in however they wanted to. In 1831, the Vermont legislature first started setting boundaries on that, although it's kind of in the opposite direction of how we think about conservation now, where they imposed a bounty on bears. And again, according to our first bear biologist, Charlie Willie, he estimated or was able to determine that, you know, almost 1,300 bounty claims were paid out by the state during that period. And then we don't need to look at all these in detail. I feel like we did go through them the last time I was here, but the point here is that, you know, in the early 40s, we started setting limits around how people could take bears in Vermont. And there's been a lot of push and pull and tweaks and changes to this whole process. I just think the point here is that this is like a work in progress. And it's a flexible thing where we are able to adjust regulations to meet the needs of bear population, society's interests. And again, yeah, it's kind of like a living thing that will continue, and who knows in what directions. But again, these, you know, these little tweaks do create flexibility and it creates an adaptive system for managing and regulating the bear population. And then also just put this into context, you know, we're not an island unto ourselves, right? Like black bear range exists throughout much of North America. And so, you know, I just share this to show like every jurisdiction that has a resident bear population, you know, works through this same process that we work through in determining what regulations make sense for their public and for their bear population and the status of their bear population. You know, I'll point out these jurisdictional surveys of how folks are managing bears happen every so many years. The last time one happened, Missouri did not have a bear hunting season. But their population had recovered to a point where they can sustain a season, and the public was interested in that. Right, you've got other states like Florida and Connecticut where I think the biologists there feel like their populations have recovered, they could handle a sustainable harvest, but it's still kind of weighing out whether the public wants that or not. So here in Vermont, now knowing kind of the regulatory history around our bear harvest, let's talk about the actual population. And first, I just want to speak a little bit to the structure of how the model works that we use to estimate our bear population. So this is an age reconstruction model that we use. And it really is, we are taking information from known dead bears throughout the state, combining that with some information that we know about the structure of bear populations, combining that information to build back. If we know we have this many bears dead at the end of the year, we must have had a population at this size at the beginning. So there's two data sets that we use to kind of inform our model. We're taking our hunting mortality data, so it's a count and age of females from the harvest, and a count and age of males from the harvest, and then also a total count. And then more recently, we've also been adding our incidental mortality data. And what I mean by this is bears that were not killed due to hunting. So the vast majority of these mortalities are from vehicle collisions. And then of course, a smaller number of them are from conflict situations, and then an even smaller number of them are just from freak incidents like bears biting electrical wires off of telephone poles and electrocuting themselves and random things like that. And so again, you know, the idea is these deaths are happening in a somewhat predictable way so that we understand that they are a true reflection of what the population is in order for us to model it. And so this is what that population estimate looks like over time. And I will just focus before we start getting into kind of the specifics of everything, like our focus here is the trend of this population. We can get into the weeds on all the dynamics of bear population, but there's so many different factors that go into each individual year. It's important to look at those individual years. You can't get tunnel vision on them. You have to also step back and look at the big picture. Before I talk about the big picture, I'll just kind of point out, kind of get you a little more oriented to this. So these lines, that estimate, right? This is not a census. We're not going out and counting every bear in the state. So the output from these models is giving you a range. And so these lines are the range each year. The top is kind of the max end of the range. The bottom dash is the low end of the range. And then the dash that's usually somewhere kind of in the middle is like the mean, the average of that range. Because again, population is running the data through multiple scenarios, and each scenario is going to pump out a number, and that creates the range, and then some mean in the middle, kind of in the middle. So over time, you know, back in the early 70s, you know, our population was, you know, somewhere between maybe 1,500 to 2,500, little fluctuations up and down. But when we start to look back, you can see this pretty steady growth happening until around the mid-1990s. And then from the 1990s up until present times, really, there's a lot going on, but really when you look at this as a whole, you see this pattern within an overall stable population. So you can kind of see we've got years, like a few years of growth, followed by decline, growth, decline, growth, decline. But that growth and decline is pretty consistently happening somewhere between like a range of 4,000 to maybe 7,000 to 7,500 bears. And then when you look at the past 5 years, there is a clear pattern of growth. With the most recent estimate, which again, I don't think I said this before, these estimates are always 1 year behind because we have to wait until the end of the year to compile all of that dead bear data to build back to what the population was before those bears died. So this is 2022. Last year, we were at somewhere roughly between 7,000 and 8,500 bears. So that's a lot. It's a lot. You know, you look back over time, we have been in this ballpark in the past, but we are at a high point for sure. And so now, you know, time will tell over the next couple of years if our population maintains this overall stability. We expect to see a decline again, but if we don't, we will have to reassess.
What happened in 2011?
Yeah, so another important thing to point out is 2018 is, and then I'll get to your question, but some more background. 2018 was when mandatory 2 submission came into play. And so you notice since then, those like confidence limits, the scope of the scale start staying pretty consistent. Because again, it is really critical to have a representative sample from the population. And remember what I said, what goes into that is not just the count of females and males, but it's the count at each age within the harvest. And so when we were only getting voluntary 2 submission, there was a lot of variability from year to year, how many teeth we got. And in years like this, we probably were missing, we got weird numbers back basically in terms of like what the model was expecting to see, where we may have gotten way more older male teeth to age. And again, it's because there's probably a lot of bias going into the teeth that we're getting submitted to us, right? Like if you're a hunter and you shot this huge, big, gnarly looking male, you want to know how old that bear was. But if you shot a 2-year-old male, like, and you might not take the time to pull the tooth and mail it in or drop it off. So again, this is really highlights why that mandatory 2 submission was so important. And so it's not to say that 2011 isn't valuable information, but like, where were we in this huge range? We can't say. So, yeah.
Are they close on a tooth? I mean, for aging? Is there a lot of, could be, just 8, but could be more?
Yeah, so Maxon's lab, who does our aging, they do a little bit of a rating scale with each age. And so sometimes it will be like 7, but yeah, could be 5 or 6. And sometimes, you know, they'll also be like, we couldn't age this tooth. Like it either got broken when the hunter tried to pull it, or for whatever reason, like something happened where they weren't able to. Which is why when I showed you what we put into the data we put into our model, like even though now we're getting, you know, almost all of the teeth submitted to us, it's still not even like 100% of the teeth that we send to the lab that we actually get ages back on. So we still have to put that raw count of the harvest in to accommodate for that. But in general, Matson's does a fabulous job. I mean, they are aging the harvested species for most state agencies, and not just bears, like deer, fur bears, moose, like, yeah, they are very skilled at what they do. Any other questions on this? Am I missing anything, Katie? Did I forget to say anything? All right, so knowing what the population looks like and the trend over time, here's what our harvest looks like from 1963 up through last year. And the blue portion of each of these bars are the males in the harvest. The orange part are the females in the harvest. And then this yellow are certain years, some portion of the harvest, we just don't get a sex on that bear. So you can also see that since really the like late, or not even late, really kind of the whole 80s, we've been seeing this progression of increase in our harvest. Where especially the last 3 harvests were, record-setting harvests, which is another reason why patience is important when we think about where our bear population is at the moment. There's a lot that goes into why our population has grown and is stable over time. Some of it is the management that we're doing, the habitat conservation work, having this harvest help influence the number of bears we have in the state. But it's ecology, right? There's so many factors that go into all of this. But again, this is the biggest source of mortality for bears in Vermont. So this is an important part of what influences our bear population. And then this is kind of just to give you a sense of the distribution of our harvest in the state. This map over here kind of represents what we consider core bear habitat and the distribution of our bears up until the late 80s. And again, still reflecting that recovery phase of our population where they were still somewhat restricted to the greens and the Northeast Kingdom, but you can see they're starting to establish outside of that restricted area. And then if you look at the distribution of our harvest from 2020, 2021, and 2022, I mean, again, you can see bears are being harvested pretty much statewide, except for the islands, where we do not have an established bear population. And I will say, if you overlapped our bear incident reports on this, all of this outside of the islands would have bear occurrences happening. And so then our model has there's multiple assumptions that go into it, but a really important one is this relationship between the age of males and females in our harvest. And it's important for us to be tracking that to make sure the data we're putting into our model fits with what our model expects. And then of course, right, females are the driver of a population. So it's also very important to keep a close eye on what that harvest looks like for female bears. This is not, from my perspective, a very intuitive figure, so let me kind of explain what's going on. The harvest is always skewed, for the most part, towards males. So this 50% and these percentages here are what percent of the harvest was males. And again, it's starting at 50%. And so this blue line, again, are the percent of males in the harvest. And so you can see, just like our population, there's some big swings up and down over time. And again, like I said earlier, it's important to look at individual years, but don't get tunnel vision. Make sure you're looking at that overall trend. And what we have seen is that over time, males make up 50% of our harvest. And that has remained relatively true, even if you segment the harvest over time in smaller chunks. And then you also look at this dashed line is like a trend line, so showing how is this percent males trending over time. We didn't check statistical significance. I have a feeling, even though this shows it's trending slightly up with the harvest having slightly more males in it, I doubt that is statistically significant, but at the very least it shows it's remaining relatively stable. And so even when you have these big swings in 2020 where the harvest was pretty much 50% males, 50% female, it's still getting balanced out by these other years where it skews way more than average towards males. We want to talk any more about the population at the moment. we'll shift gears into this, it's all related.
I just
Yeah.
have, before we get into that topic.
Yes.
One of the things, being on the board, I've, in the last 4 years, I've gotten a ton of comments on all kinds of seasons that we have, hunting seasons that we have. And, the majority of people understand why we have seasons and why we harvest animals. But some still don't understand. They're beautiful animals, let's enjoy the animals. Can you tell me briefly, or tell us briefly, what would happen to our bear population and our bear habitat if we didn't have an annual season on them? Without,
Yeah.
a brief answer, and it may not be that easy, but just to hear that and get that out with the impact would be.
Yeah, I mean, just to rewind a smidge, like one thing when I talk to people about why we hunt bears is, again, like this is, I think a lot of people don't understand that you can eat bear meat. It's actually quite delicious. So again, I point that out to people, like this is an important locally sourced, available meat for Vermonters who choose to participate. And, and then you can get into all of the we're all diverse in what motivates people to care about the natural world. But for some people, this is what connects them and helps them connect with these animals and with nature and developing this conservation sense. If we didn't harvest bears, it's hard to say exactly, but there's a good point to this because, there's this concept of biological carrying capacity. And that, the idea behind that is you've got enough habitat and resources to support a population. And if the population gets beyond what the resources can support, it's going to self-regulate. The problem with bears is because they're supremely flexible, they are not just restricted to wild foods, right? We're already living with this and seeing this and have been seeing it for decades, is that they are going to find alternate foods. And you spend time in states like New Jersey and Connecticut and parts of Florida that have resident flourishing bear populations when you at least look at the sheer number of bears. But if you look at where they're spending their time, it's not what you think of bear habitat for sure. And so, we're not going to self-implode if we didn't have bear hunting, but we would lose the ability to have a way to influence, the number of bears in our state. I did spend some time working down in Connecticut, and cars and conflicts are what are controlling that population right now. Is the number of bears hit and killed on the roads is striking. We had some females collared for years, and talking with the biologists down there, they never had offspring that successfully dispersed. They were, every litter within 2 years, they were showing up dead on the road somewhere. Yeah, and this is again, so I can't say that would happen here in Vermont. We do have a lot more space, we've got less people, but yeah, it's hard to predict.
And when you lose that control, it's hard to get it back.
Probably, yeah. You don't know, maybe 100 years things would change culturally, but yeah, I think if we lost it, it would be gone for quite a while. Yeah. So, human-bear interactions. So this figure is showing us the reported human-bear incidents annually in Vermont, represented by the blue bars. The yellow kind of points between the lines here are the incidental mortalities. And I mentioned before, since 2018, we have been adding that into our population model. We're hoping to go back in time more. We just need to we've been collecting this data for a while, but it's a slightly newer data set because we have been seeing drastic increases in it over time. So anyways, I think the take home from this figure is twofold. The first, which is pretty cool, is you see a clear alternating pattern in these bars and in the incidental mortalities. And I would say these mirror the beech nut crop. So a bad kind of conflict here is usually following a good beech nut year. So, 2015 good beech nuts, 2016 bad, 2017 good, 2018 bad, and so forth. The other pattern that's important to see here is the increase. And I will say, so, this is lightly shaded 2023 because we're nowhere near done compiling the data from this year yet. And reports are still coming in, although very slowly at this point. But, even our good years are now much higher than what our good years were 6 years ago. So what is driving this? It's a lot of different things. Obviously, the number of bears and the distribution of bears on the landscape with the number of people and the distribution of people on the landscape. The more people and bears there are, the more opportunities they have to interact with each other. But again, if you take those reported bear incidents and overlay them with the population, there's no pattern to be seen. So it's not just the number of bears that is driving these conflicts. Wild food availability is a huge part of this. The research is very clear that your average bear is going to choose wild foods over human foods. Human food availability, obviously, is another big part of that. And these two, again, tie in together with bear behavior. So when wild foods are less available, bears are going to be more desperate to find an alternate food source. If human foods are highly available, there's a good chance that bear is going to interact or find an opportunity to interact with one of those human food sources. Every time, every meal is a learning experience for these long-lived animals that are forming memories and adjusting behaviors based on life experiences. So what happens for some individual bears as this learning of human foods develops into first what we call food conditioning, where now instead of only searching for human foods out of desperation, it just becomes a normal part of their foraging behavior. And then that can also lead to another term that we have, habituation, where those bears learn to become very comfortable in human-dominated spaces and near people. And that often makes us very uncomfortable. Or not us, but I mean people in general. A lot of people get really uncomfortable when they're sitting on their back deck and a bear walks right up past them to go sniff their barbecue grill. So we know bears have easy access to human foods here in Vermont because you all are telling us about it. This is the data from those. Oh wait, I want to say one more thing that's important. Human behavior, right, plays into this too in multiple ways. One just being we could do more to control these attractants, but the other part of it is people's willingness to call and report to us. And so we can't ignore that. Some of these inflated numbers are because we're asking people to report this to us. We have made it easier and easier for people to submit these reports to us because it is really vital for us to make good management decisions. And so the easier we make it and the more we tell people we want to hear from them, of course, they're going to report more. And so that is another component that's going on as well. All right, so now when people reach out to us and report what's going on, almost half of the reports we receive involve garbage. That is by far and away our biggest problem. And again, this is not unique to Vermont. Go talk to bear biologists across North America. Garbage is a huge, huge problem. Bird feeders are the other really big problem. along with backyard chickens. And then compost is a growing problem in Vermont. So what can we do about it? We can continue to take steps to try to influence the size and distribution of our bear population. And I would argue, looking at our population over time, like we've been doing a really good job sustainably harvesting our bear population in a way that is maintaining an overall stable bear population. We can continue to, conserve and provide habitat so that they have as much wild food as possible. We can try to manage individual bear behaviors, which we do. But that is kind of like spinning in the wind because it's really hard to change a bear's behavior if the food source is not addressed. So we can use techniques to make bears uncomfortable when they come to get human foods, scare them, to try to change their behavior. But again, research on this is also pretty clear. That's really only effective if you couple it with restricting access to those human foods. So really, this is where we are putting the majority of our focus when we are thinking about minimizing human-bear conflicts. The majority of our effort is going into educating people to try to get them to change their behavior. And so we're doing this in a whole bunch of ways. Like I referenced a minute ago, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, we created this web reporting form that we're still trying to tweak and improve to make it even more intuitive and easier. So we've been, and again, the public also knows they can call us, email us, contact their game wardens directly. So people are reaching out to us in multiple ways, but over time, this is becoming the most dominant way people are contacting us, which is great. Every person that submits a report to us gets an email or a phone call back, and sometimes also a site visit with detailed information specific to their situation, telling them how they can secure whatever attractant it was that brought the bear in, encouraging them to also talk to their neighbors and spread the information we're sharing with their friends, neighbors, everybody else in their community. We're putting up signs, kind of old school techniques, but it seems to work as well. Developing strategic advice to help people, especially with the food scraps. People are kind of adjusting to now having to compost their food scraps, making sure we're giving advice to help with that. Again, this is where the vast majority of our effort is going, is trying to empower people to have the skills and knowledge they need to secure those attractants and prevent conflict from happening. And then again, knowing that garbage is our biggest issue, one published study and another that hasn't been published yet, really looked at what happens if you can get the majority of people, either in a community or an HOA or a neighborhood, to start using bear-resistant garbage containers. And they're finding that when you can kind of get some, more than half at least, you will start seeing a decrease in your bear conflicts. And so we're really right now in the early stages of partnering with DEC, their solid waste program, and starting to open lines of communication with our solid waste haulers, the garbage guys, to figure out how we can get to a place where bear-resistant garbage containment is more of a standard here in Vermont. Yeah.
Touch on your kind of innovative one you're working.
Yeah. One of the projects we're doing is we're actually working with UVM, but it's at the engineering school, and I have a group of senior mechanical engineers who are trying to create a bear-resistant garbage can design that we're hoping can be a launching off point for some of our solid waste companies to kind of take and run. We'll see what comes of it. It's kind of interesting. And then I like to end all my presentations with this quote, because I just feel like, for me, it really rings true in thinking about not just bears, but all wildlife. we are participants in the natural world with these animals. And this is, you know, coexistence is really a central theme to Black Bears. We're trying to set up a successful way to coexist with these animals by offering them the habitats they need, you know, allowing people opportunity to harvest them, but in a sustainable way, providing opportunity for people to know that they are a vibrant part of the ecosystem and appreciate it. Again, it's messy. It's very messy and kind of requires constant push and pull. I've been up here for a long time. So are there any more questions or? Yeah.
Are there any, I know so much of our data set comes pretty much all from the two that you mentioned, which are carcasses.
Yeah.
Are any other states in the country collecting data in any other way? Is there anything happening?
Yeah, definitely. So starting in like the 90s, there was, you know, a lot of these technology and innovation around genetics. And so a lot of states, yeah, a lot of places either don't have harvest for bears and don't have like a dead bear data set. What we use is called like a non-invasive technique. So where you'll set up in a systematic way these hair snare traps, collect hair, do genetic analysis, and you can model your population with using that data. New Hampshire actually did a study years ago. It was so long ago, I was actually a technician on the project, but where they actually did that. So they, like us, use harvest data to model their population. But they did that hair snare study to see, like, to kind of test if the harvest data was working the way they thought it would. And really what they found was that the hair snare effort worked. Like they kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, they were complementary, maybe, is that? That's not quite the word, but.
The results matched each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Verified, yeah.
Yeah. The New Hampshire doesn't still do that because that is very expensive and time consuming, right? Connecticut did that quite a few years ago also because they don't have a harvest, right? And they were all these conflicts happening, but they didn't have a great sense of like what was going on with the bear population. So they worked with a PhD student to do the same thing. Again, the downside is that it's pretty labor intensive, it's expensive, and it only gives you a snapshot. I mean, all of this, even the harvest data, it's only a snapshot. It's only 1 year's worth of data. So unless you can find a way to repeat it, you're only gonna have a snapshot, and that's good for a little bit, but then pretty quickly you move past it and you don't know where you are again. You know, there's a lot of innovative work being done with cameras. Although I have not heard of any, bears are tough, you know, cameras are being used for certain species that have very clear identifiable markers like tigers and leopards and things like that, where you can evaluate population or identify individuals and build back a population from that. But it's not, yeah, no one's figured that out for bears yet.
I like distribution, I mean, it's helpful for other things.
Yeah.
Yeah, not population.
Yeah. Is there any other technique I'm missing, Keith? I mean, hair snares are really a big one for bears. And it's because it's really easy to get them to rub up against barbed wire. So it does work well, but it's.
Especially when it's baited with old tuna.
Yeah.
Sardines. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question.
There must be split snares too, I mean, the live trap bear.
Yeah, there's a few different trap types you can use to catch them. Yeah, I mean, some of them are a great one. And some states are using, they're collecting population, like demographic data. So they're collaring bears, monitoring reproduction at den sites. And so again, that can be informative. And a lot of states are developing these like integrated population models where it's taking their harvest data, their incidental mortality data, their demographic data, like repro and survival from collared bears. Yeah, and so that is another way is to have, it gets tricky with bears to go beyond, it gets tricky with bears because adult males, as I experienced with the Deerfield study, are really tricky to keep a GPS column on. we found that once a male got over 200, 230 pounds, it is gonna take that collar off if it wants, because their necks get bigger or as big as their heads, and you can't safely put a collar on tight enough to keep it on them. So most folks that use capture bears and collar them are really only focusing on the female component of their population. But again, it provides really invaluable data.
Is there any secret to looking at a bear and accurately guessing how big it is? I mean, everybody who sees a bear sees a huge bear.
Yeah, I know.
And, and then you get three people standing beside each other looking at that bear, and that bear ranges from 75 pounds to 300 pounds.
Yeah, so
It's just
things to look at are, when we look at the head, how big do those ears look? Bigger bears are gonna have smaller ears because their ears kind of are like, they kind of stay the same and then the head grows into them. You also kind of want to look at how leggy they look. So like how much space is there between their chest and the ground? The longer the legs, again, usually means a younger bear that has not healed into itself yet. I think another thing that helps people is like to actually know what real Vermont bear weights range from. When we were doing the Deerfield study, the heaviest female we handled was like 155 pounds. Most of our females were like 110 to 130 pounds. Again, we were working in a mountainous part of the state, not a lot of people, not a lot of like alternate food sources. Females, when I worked down in Connecticut, we handled females that were routinely 300 pounds. Where again, I don't think we have a lot of females in Vermont getting that big. But then also knowing, they can get huge. We've had males harvested that are, 400 pounds, and even over 500. So it takes just looking at a lot of bears.
Absolutely. I think David has his hand up. David?
Yes, thank you. One of the issues that is facing the board at this time is whether or not someone should have the right to shoot a female bear with cubs in sight, with the concern being that a dead mother means dead cubs. And I'm just would like to ask if you would discuss that. I'm not looking for a definitive yes, no, whatever, but I'm just curious if you would discuss that. So it might better inform any decision that I'm gonna have to make.
Yeah, so I guess, are you kind of, first I'll say like, do cubs survive if they lose their mother in the fall, right? We don't have a lot of direct data on it, and no one really does. It's a really hard thing to evaluate because it means most people, even when you're doing a study where you've got animals collared, you're often not collaring the juveniles. It's just the adults. So often if a collared female is killed, you don't know what happened. But I can say anecdotally what we observe, and that it's not easy for them. And there's a few pretty weak studies, which the petitioner highlighted in his petition, that really were pretty anecdotal themselves. They showed, sure, cubs can survive maybe a couple weeks, even a couple months after. But I think here, especially in our more northern climates, where food variability is more limited, in terms of like the diversity of foods, and our winters are pretty harsh. I can't say what percentage survive and don't survive, but I don't think the chances are great. And I think they can hang on for a while, but again, we get reports every year of cubs on their own showing up in people's backyards out of desperation, and we're scooping them up and sending them to a rehabilitator in New Hampshire. We don't know what happened to those sows. In some cases, like we do, we know it was a conflict situation. We know it was a roadkill situation. But yeah, again, there's a reason they stayed with their mom for that 16-ish months. You know, it's learning about food and its protection and, yeah.
Hey, Jacqueline, is it okay if I ask just?
No, thank you for asking though. Okay, thank you. Any other questions on the presentation?
Orphan cubs are never taken in by another bear, right?
We don't know if it happens naturally, but I know some biologists who have facilitated that and it has successfully worked. But again, these are like things that are happening in the wild that, you know, the shadows of nature. We don't know all these specifics. And when that fostering has happened, it's my understanding that it's usually early in the year. When they're still, I think, developing that bond and the cubs are still pretty little. I don't think it's happening later in the year. And I know like some southern states feel pretty strongly that by the fall, cubs will be fine on their own. But again, I think they're dealing with different systems than we are up here in the northern part of the country.
Great presentation.
Thank you, Jack.
And it looks that like the bear management process has been very successful.
Yeah.
Based on what you presented us tonight, and things are moving in the right direction. And so great job.
Thank you. Wow, my predecessor has done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you gonna be back next month for questions? Or
We'll probably,
I think, yeah.
let's wait till next month.
Okay. So with that, we move on to the commissioner's update.
Well, again, I want to thank Jackie, and once again, you see the amazing people that the department has with respect to managing the wildlife habitat. I wanted to mention that the site we normally have our meetings is unavailable because of the flooding. The DMV is using it for road testing. They could do the test and the facilitation. And the Dill building is unavailable because of flooding for other reasons. And so that's why we're here tonight, but understanding that it's even further away than some folks. Abigail and Dave Sawsville and myself are working on trying to secure a location in Randolph. So we hope to have that secured for the next meeting. So more to come on that. So you're able to hear that? Yes.
Thank you.
We want to see you in person and have you not yell at us through the.
I want to shake everybody's hand.
I'll just add that attending a meeting remotely last month was very frustrating. It was the first one, frustrating in that you didn't get the same wraparound feeling of the meeting that you're attending. It was very narrow focus of what's going on. So yeah, the more we can do to try to get all members straight would be great.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the intent. So we'll make sure everyone knows when and where and all that. I wanted to commend the board, but I also really wanted to commend the department staff for the work they did on the development of the rules. And you should all be aware that we are presenting to Elkhart on October 5th. And there's a lot of work still to do in terms of developing the presentation, but I feel confident that we met the intent of the legislation that drove the rulemaking. As you all know, Mark Scott retired. We're in the process, in the hiring process to replace Mark. And right now, Dr. Rosalind Renfrew is serving as the interim director of the Wildlife Division. This wasn't planned, but there was a comment earlier about the hunter ed classes and some of the work that they've been doing. They're in full swing right now, and we expect to have, once we're done, over 900 folks become certified while learning about the ecology, conservation, and safe and ethical hunting practices. And I just want to remind the board that these classes, you've probably been 100 years since any of you have been through them, but we do stress the ethics of being out, but even as much as leave the woods as you found them, to what's an ethical shot, what does it mean to be a conservationist, that we're part of the ecology. Jackie mentioned that. We're not observers, we are part of nature. And most importantly though, we are stressing, and there's been some public messaging about safety. That's my biggest concern, is that all of our hunters come back. And lastly, I'd like to touch on some of the comments that I was witness to and that were sent to a board member after the last meeting. It was truly unfortunate to see the sexist and threatening comments made to a particular board member for simply working to come to a better understanding of the topic. I remain appalled and aghast at the depths of which people who claim to care about the welfare of wildlife go to when communicating to and about board members, Fish and Wildlife staff, and others who simply do not agree with their opinion. I once again call on all people who truly care about these issues to communicate in a way that demonstrates respect and remain issue-related and not to attack individuals. And with that, that is my report.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I would definitely second that final statement of yours, that I think we've all been party to those emails. And they can be very frustrating and maddening at times, because a lot of times people just don't have access to the same information that we do, the same scientific information that you present us. And people may not understand where we're coming from in some of the decisions that we make. So I would just encourage, if people don't have that understanding, to continue to ask questions of board members or of the department. And it does all boil down to education and understanding the science behind some of these decisions. And as a board, we are very fortunate to have the experts that we have at our disposal through the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we place a great deal of importance on what they recommend to us. And we have a great deal of confidence in those recommendations to us. So thank you for bringing that up, and I support that 100%. Okay, does any board members have any statements or anything they would like to add? Any questions for the commissioner or the department?
There's food, right? So after we adjourn, I believe Abigail once again made something yummy. So do that.
Jacqueline, thank you again very much. Great presentation.
See that? I get to miss the meal. Hey.
Well, send
move this meeting.
It's going to come in 5 to 10 days.
I'd just like to, we don't have the opportunity to thank Mark in person, but which is unfortunate, but he was one of the influences that I came to the board. Mark and Lois Porter. They worked with them both, knew them both, and I'm going to miss Mark's depth of knowledge is going to be hard to replace, and I wish him the best.
So I will say this, lest you think that Brad, myself, or anybody else was remiss, Mark specifically asked for not any kind of recognition. So that's why, even though we knew it was coming, we said nothing until after he left. demonstrate this humility.
Please pass along our thanks.
Absolutely, I will.
Okay, if I can have a motion.
So made.
Okay, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Got it, meeting adjourned, thank you.
Thank you all.
What I've been asking, they-
Yeah.
No, I only know you into the work, or old maintenance.
You do it right.